Alright, y'all just bear with me on this video. Doing this on my cell phone kind of as an afterthought. I figured it'd be something nice to post and maybe help somebody out. Again, this is not a full step-by-step tutorial. I don't have any fancy editing software, and so I'm basically recording it, and what comes out of my mouth is going to go on the video without editing. And whatever I do is just pretty much how it's happening. So anyway, previous video we talked about putting that filler strip in here to compensate for the extended depth that these tiles go through. And like I said, it's pretty important. You could probably get away without doing it. I like to do it. What it's going to do is going to fill that bottom portion in, harder to grab a hold of and pull off. One thing I want to point out is you want to make sure that you bring it all the way out to your radius, because in this whole installation, this little bugger right here is going to be your weakest point, because you can see there's not a lot of surface area there to apply adhesive and stick it. And so you want to go ahead and make sure that you get that fillers all the way out and radiused. The way I did it is I cheated and used my Sawzall. You could use a hand saw, a coping saw, whatever you got at hand. When I installed these filler strips down here, I glued them and I nailed them in with finish nails. Now you can get some good quality construction adhesive. I happen to like the Loctite stuff here. Let's see if I can spin it around a little bit better. And Loctite makes a really good quality product. They've got the stuff that's called Instagrab, and that helps with your initial adhesion. And that's not the Instagrab, but it's really strong and it's durable. And you could get away with just doing that, just gluing it on, and with clamps. I initially tried to use these pinch clamps, or whatever you want to call it. They're a ratcheting clamp, but they don't have enough depth. I've got other clamps made by Irwin with the pistol grip handle that would have worked out really well, but I didn't bring them. You can use C-clamps. You know, if you could even use duct tape if it came down to it. Like I said, I nailed it in. I have the advantage of owning this bad boy right here. This thing is a lifesaver, especially if you do a lot of trim. It's basically a nail gun, and it'll shoot up to 3-inch finish nails, as you can see them right here. And that's how I put mine on. Now, if you wanted to nail it on and you didn't want to go out and spend, I think this cost me like $250. And it's battery operated, which is great because you don't have to haul around a compressor and air hoses for your air guns. You could, I think Bostitch makes them. They're basically electric staplers. If you're familiar with the old staple guns where you got the pinch handle and you push it down and shoots a staple, you could get the electric version of that, and it'll also shoot what's called brads, which are basically a small finish nail, and you could go along there with that little with the brads and the electric stapler, and just go along the bottom here. Once you put glue on, I still recommend you glue it, even if you're going to nail it in. And then you can use that electric stapler shooting those brads, and they don't have to be fantastic. You know, like I said, I'm shooting 2-inch ones out of there, and I actually divoted because this is just a little over 2 inches, this lip right here, and I did divot the top in a couple spots, which is fine because you're not going to see it once I start laying that tile. But you could use like inch and a quarter brads in those electric staplers, and and do just fine. Getting that to stay in place until the glue sets and the brads or the nails, however you want to say it. That'll help keep it in place and give it added strength. Here you can see some of the divots I was talking about, but like I said, that's no worries. Once I put the tile in, you want to make sure that your edge is flush. I know in my previous video I said I'd use plywood, which I did cut some plywood strips. They're, you know, plywood, even though it says it's 1/2 inch, it's not. It's like a 32nd of an inch thinner than that. Kind of like the 2x4s nowadays are only 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches nominal. And so your 1/2 inch plywood is actually just a hair under a 1/2 inch. I had the advantage that I've got a table saw, so I just ripped some of these plywood strips off of a piece of scrap 1/2 inch plywood I had. You could also use a circular saw with a rip guide on it. Actually, I don't know if they would actually go down small enough to do that. Do a 1/2 inch wide cut. You could just strike lines. You know, you have to strike each one individually. You know, what I mean is you strike a 1/2 inch line, cut it off your sheet, and then strike another one. You can't just go down the line and strike a bunch of lines a 1/2 inch apart, because your saw kerf, the thickness of the saw blade is going to throw it off 1/8 of an inch. So your next one won't be a 1/2 inch, it'll be 3/8, and then your next one will be 1/4 of an inch. So that's one way of doing it if you don't have a table saw. I did luck out at my shop. I wound up having some of this scrap that was just perfect already. It's, you know, basically 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. That's the white strips that you see underneath the lip of the countertop. And what this came off of, I think I had to cut down a pre-hung door or a door jamb. And so in a previous job I did, and I had two basically 8-foot sections of this. It's not plywood, it's almost like a high density cardboard, or a kind of along the same lines of this stuff, but in this one you can see the chunks. In this one I think they use a finer grade of wood pulp or wood dust, whatever you want to call it, and they glue it together and compress it in a high pressure press and glue sets, and then you got that stuff. It's not the greatest in the world, but for this purpose here, it'll work just fine. And looking back at it, you know, I probably would have been better off going with maybe an inch overhang on this lip here. Like I said, it's a 1/2 inch. I think standard countertops do hang over about an inch, but my thing was economy. I was trying to do this for the least amount of money as possible. And so your base cabinets are generally 24 inches in depth, and your standard particle board comes in 4x8 sheets, so I just ripped it in half and went with that. And in order to get this 1/2 inch overhang, I kind of cheated along the walls, as you can see here. And that's not a real big deal, because when you put, let me get a piece of tile. This is the tile I'll be using, Home Depot special on clearance. When you get ready to set this tile in place and you glue it down, you're going to have that gap underneath there, but it's not, you know, it's not going to be a real big deal unless somebody took a hammer to it and started beating against the wall like that. But then you're going to crack the damn tile anyway, whether it's got support underneath it or not. And another thing too that helps out is this is an older house. Nothing's square in this thing anymore. Nothing is plumb. And what that means is level on the vertical. And none of the corners are square, especially since this was a remodel. It's an older remodel. And from what I saw from the other places in the house, they didn't do such a good job. I don't know who the previous owners hired, but I wouldn't hire them anymore. So anyway, nothing is square. You can see there's no gap here against this wall, but as you go down, it opens up. And then again, I got my gap back in there. So when you have that situation, you don't have to worry about getting really tight fitment or fitting of this particle board into those corners. When you go to lay your tile, that's where you'll start making up for your out of square. And in the grand scheme of things, you won't even notice. It won't even be noticeable unless it's, you know, really, really bad. Instead of a 90-degree corner, you know, they screwed it up and you've got an 80-degree corner. Well, then you might notice it on your grout lines when you're laying your tile out. Far than that, you're not going to notice it. I think that's about it for now. So I'll go ahead and start laying out the edge tile. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these corners in and get those glued into place and give them a little bit of time to set up so I don't disturb them when I start fitting my edge tiles in. So I'll come back to that here in a few minutes.